Thanks. Good morning, everyone. You will have received a report that we've just issued on Sudan, which makes, unfortunately, for very grim reading. This is a report that the High Commissioner will present to the Human Rights Council in its upcoming session. Entrenched impunity is fueling gross human rights violations and abuses in Sudan as fighting spreads to more parts of the country and involves additional armed actors. Broader international effort is needed towards accountability and to stem the flow of arms. The report details attacks on densely populated areas as well as IDP camps, markets, and schools, as well as a sustained pattern of attacks on medical facilities. It also documents ethnically motivated summary executions. The continued and deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian objects, as well as summary executions, sexual violence, and other violations and abuses, underscore the utter failure by both parties to respect the rules and principles of international humanitarian and human rights law. Some of these acts may amount to war crimes. They must be investigated promptly and independently with a view to bringing those responsible to justice. The international community should, among other measures, expand the arms embargo and the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court to cover the whole of Sudan. They currently only cover the region of Darfur. Conflict-related sexual violence has also been documented, and urgent steps must be taken by the parties to put an end to the persistent use of sexual violence and to hold those responsible to account and to provide redress for survivors. Our report also details widespread disappearances and a generalized crackdown on civic space, including killings of journalists and attacks on human rights defenders. Since April 2023, when the conflict began, it has triggered the world's largest displacement crisis and an unprecedented food security situation, with half the population facing acute food insecurity and famine conditions confirmed in at least 5 locations. The conflict has also undermined the rights to health and education, with 70 to 80% of health facilities rendered non-functional and over 90% of school-aged children left with no access to formal education. As fighting intensifies for control of Khartoum and El Fasher, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, remains very concerned about the protection of civilians, particularly those belonging to groups that have been subjected to persistent discrimination. We stress that accountability, regardless of the rank and affiliation of the perpetrators, is critical to breaking the recurring cycle of violence and impunity in Sudan. I'll pass the floor now to the head of our Sudan office, Ms. Li Feng.
Good morning and greetings from Port Sudan. The report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sudan issued today highlights the expansion of the conflict across the country in 2024. It details the devastating impact of hostilities on civilians across Sudan and on fundamental human rights, including to life, liberty and security, non-discrimination, food, health and water. Attacks on densely populated areas involving airstrikes, drones and artillery shelling continue to impact upon civilians and civilian infrastructure, particularly in Khartoum, Darfur and areas of Kordofan. We documented multiple attacks on civilian objects, including markets, IDP camps and schools. The report documents deliberate attacks against specifically protected objects, in particular health facilities. For example, the Al Saudi Maternity Hospital in Fasher came under repeated attack in 2024. Thousands of civilian lives have been lost as a result of the hostilities and direct attacks on civilians, including targeted attacks on villages and retaliatory attacks. This includes cases of summary executions that are largely ethnically motivated or based on perceived affiliation to the opposing party to the conflict. As at the end of December 2024, our office had documented 152 incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involving at least 251 victims. Reports of sexual violence appear to follow a geographic pattern as the fighting spread across the country, illustrating its consistent use as a weapon of war by a growing number of actors. More than half of the reported incidents involved gang rape. Cases of sexual violence remain vastly underreported. In 2024, we documented multiple reports of disappearances and missing persons, including through widespread arbitrary arrests and detention, In this context, civic space came under increasing threat. The report finds that gross violations and abuses of international human rights law, as well as serious violations of international humanitarian law, have been committed by the parties to the conflict. As entrenched impunity was a key driver of the conflict and continues to fuel it, accountability is critical to prevent further violations and abuses. Since the beginning of 2025, the situation has escalated further, with ongoing battles in multiple hotspots. Regrettably, civilians continue to bear the brunt of the escalating violence. In recent weeks, hostilities have intensified in Khartoum, North Darfur, and Kordofan, and more recently in White Nile. We are particularly concerned about recurrent RSF attacks on Zamzam IDP camp in El Fasher and on surrounding villages. We are alarmed about documented summary executions allegedly attributed to SAF-affiliated fighters and militia in Al Jazeera, Khartoum, and North Kordofan. Many people were reportedly targeted based on ethnic identity and perceived affiliation with the RSF. Such reports continue to be received in Al Jazeera. We have also received reports of threats against humanitarian volunteers who have stayed behind to help those in need. And there are growing reports of hate speech and incitement to violence, often in the context of targeted attacks against civilians. The increasing ethnic dimensions of the conflict and growing polarization within communities is deeply troubling. Also of concern is an increasing trend of attacks on critical water and power infrastructure. Last week, I visited Kassala in eastern Sudan, where I firsthand the impact of the conflict in areas where there are no active hostilities. Kassala is hosting hundreds of thousands of IDPs who have fled conflict and violence. I had the opportunity to hear from women who have been displaced multiple times. This made clear the major challenges of providing for such large numbers of IDPs and of planning for safe and sustainable returns. I'm here in Port Sudan now, aiming to reinitiate direct dialogue with authorities and institutions to pursue our mandate on the promotion and protection of human rights in Sudan. The situation in Sudan has reached a dangerous tipping point. Now is the time to renew focus on the human rights crisis in Sudan and take all necessary measures to protect civilians and prevent further violations and abuses. It remains urgent to ensure critical humanitarian assistance can reach those in need. Together, we must stand with the people of Sudan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liv Fungen and Ravina. Just before opening the floor to questions, I'd like to remind you that yesterday our colleagues, both UNHCR and OCHA, launched the 2025 Sudan Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan and the Regional Refugee Response Plans. As you may have heard yesterday from Tom Fletcher, these two appeals, these two plans request $6 billion to support close to 21 million people in Sudan and up to 5 million others who are primarily refugees in neighboring countries. As Mr. Fletcher said yesterday, it would be a staggering amount to try and raise in normal times, let alone in the midst of a financial crisis that we are experiencing. But there was a first start at the beginning of the last weekend in Addis with 300 million raised. And we really believe that this being a humanitarian crisis is truly unprecedented, as we've also heard from our colleagues. It demands a response unprecedented in scale and intent. And just as a last information for you, also on Sudan, you may have seen that Jean-Pierre Lacroix, our Under-Secretary General for Peace Operation, will begin a visit to Sudan, South Sudan and Abyei today until the 24th of February to support, to strengthen the cooperation and coordination supporting peacekeeping efforts in the region. So I'll open the floor to questions on Sudan now. Nina. So I'll introduce you for Lee. Nina Larsson, AFP.
Yes, hi. Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask if you have more details on the ethnically motivated summary executions, if you can provide numbers and the increase you may have seen there, and also in terms of rape being used as a weapon of war. Is that also, are you also seeing ethnically motivated instances of that? Thank you.
Ravina? Fang, okay. Can you, would you like to take this one, Li Fang? Thanks.
Yes. In terms of the summary executions, the recent summary executions, these have been outlined in recent press releases in the course of January. What we have been able to do, we do not have comprehensive figures. It has been very difficult to reach these comprehensive figures because of cuts in telecommunications, in the security challenges, also because of fear of reprisals. But what we have documented in Al Jazeera State and in Khartoum, as well as in North Kordofan, are that these attacks are retaliatory against civilians based on their perceived affiliation with the RSF, and that they're often ethnically directed based on their identity from Darfurian or Kordofan tribes from Western Sudan. What we are also continuing to do is we are continuing to receive reports from Al Jazeera, which we are trying to follow up. In terms of rape and the ethnically motivated rape, indeed, as outlined in the report of the High Commissioner, in West Darfur, we had documented multiple cases of rape that were ethnically motivated against the Masalid community from late 2023 and early 2024.
Other questions in the room? Beyza is our correspondent of the Turkish news agency.
Morning, Alessandra. Thank you for taking my question. I don't know if Ravina would like to answer or Ms. Lee, but first I would like to ask about, there are concerning reports about progress of the Sudanese army in many fronts against rapid forces. Do you think this could have any ease on the facilitating of humanitarian aid or any good or bad impact in general? Also, the second question, the report recommends expanding the arms embargo beyond Darfur. What specific measures needed, as many weapons entering Sudan reportedly coming from the regional actors, and how is the UN engaging with neighboring countries to curb arms smuggling and prevent external actors from fueling the conflict? Thank you.
Thanks, Faiza. I'll take the question on the arms embargo and the flow of arms, and I'll ask my colleague Lee to take the question on humanitarian access. On the flow of arms, it's no secret, it's very clear that arms continue to flow into Sudan. We are seeing the use of very heavy weaponry in populated civilian areas. What is currently in place is an arms embargo put forth by the Security Council on Darfur in particular. And what we are calling for is for the arms embargo to be extended throughout Sudan. The High Commissioner has repeatedly called on all states who have any involvement or any leverage over parties to the conflict to use that leverage to bring this conflict to an end and to bring peace to the people of Sudan, and we would reiterate that call. International humanitarian law also requires that states respect and ensure respect for IHL, for international humanitarian law, and this encompasses the prohibition on arms transfers where there's a real risk that such arms would be used in the commission of violations against international humanitarian law.
Li Fang?
Yes, and in relation to the increasing hostilities and battles of control in various areas, particularly in Khartoum. Indeed, as I mentioned, this very fluid and dynamic security situation is a challenge to human rights, to protection, and indeed to the broader engagement of the UN in providing humanitarian assistance. It is for us, we will not speak to the issues of the humanitarian access. I think that, as was mentioned, this is part of the humanitarian response plan that was launched yesterday. But indeed, the very volatile situation poses greater risks, poses greater security challenges, and thus is a complicating factor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have a follow-up?
Quick follow-up for Ravina. Are you concerned about, as you say, there is already a selective arms embargo only affecting Darfur. Are you worried about the expanding of the embargo would not have the biggest impact as you were expecting, as they already have a stockpiles of weapons? Thank you.
The arms embargo on Darfur is also clearly not being respected. And again, this is why we are renewing our call to everyone who has any involvement. Now, this is states that may be providing weapons. It's also states that may have involvement through the supply chain as well in the provision of weapons towards this conflict, to both parties to the conflict. They need to be reminded of their obligations, not only do the parties to the conflict need to ensure that civilians are not harmed in the use of these weapons, but those who are providing arms, who are carrying out arms transfers, also need to be reminded that they have an obligation to ensure that such arms are not used in violation of international humanitarian law. And as you can see from this report, we have documented many violations that could amount to war crimes.
Thank you very much. I saw Taha Hassan, APTN.
Thank you. The situation in Sudan requires immediate action. Unfortunately, any action hasn't been taken. If there is any action be taken by United Nations or human rights, and could you also identify who has committed these violations in Sudan? Which part?
Taha, thank you for your question. I'll start with a response, and perhaps my colleague Lee might want to supplement just on the work that we are trying to do as the UN Human Rights Office on Sudan. Who is committing the violations? Unfortunately, we have documented the perpetration of gross human rights violations by both the Sudanese armed forces as well as the rapid support forces. You may recall that the High Commissioner spoke to both generals last year as well, and again, he reminded them of their obligations under international human rights law and humanitarian law to ensure that the principles of distinction, proportionality are respected. Unfortunately, since then, we have only seen a worsening of the situation. The parties to the conflict seem to be more motivated by power interests than for peace for the people of Sudan.
Lee, go ahead.
In terms of what we are doing as the UN Human Rights Office in Sudan, we have been working since 2019, pursuant to an agreement with the government of Sudan on the promotion and protection of human rights. This involves our monitoring and documentation mandate. It also involves engagement with institutions, with a broad range of interlocutors, including civil society, to be able to strengthen the promotion and protection of human rights in Sudan. Very specifically in this conflict context, we are working very closely with our UN partners and also with humanitarian partners to be able to support the response to this crisis. I wanted to reiterate again that this is a humanitarian and protection crisis that has driven the very, very enormous humanitarian crisis that has already been spoken to. Thank you.
Sorry. I would also like to remind you that the Secretary General was at the African Union meeting just now, and we have sent you extensive transcripts and readouts of his meetings. He really focused on the situation in the DRC and Sudan, so I would like to send you back to what he said on that occasion, and in particular when he was asked by one of your colleagues about the work that the UN were doing with the two parties in Sudan, he answered that his special envoy Lamamra has been in contact with the two sides. The SG himself had some contacts, and we believe that it's absolutely essential that in the holy month of Ramadan, Sudan uses this occasion to stop the fighting and create the conditions for diplomacy finally to be possible. And he spoke about Sudan much more, so I'll refer you to his interventions.